the man known to history as Charles Lucky Luciano was born Salvatore Lucania on the 24th of November 1897 in the village of Leccara Fridi, near the city of Palermo in the northwest of the island of Sicily. Salvatore's father was Antonio, a miner who worked in the local sulfur pits near Palermo. He and Salvatore always had a contentious relationship, one which got worse over the years. His mother was Rosalie. At home in Italy, he also had two siblings, a sister named Francesca and a brother by the name of Giuseppe. Another brother by the name of Bartolo was later born in New York. His name gradually changed from Salvatore Lucania over time. In his teenage years, he adopted the name Charles, as people in America had begun referring to him as Sal or Sally as an abbreviation of Salvatore, and he didn't like the sound of this. Lucania became Luciano during the 1930s, as the New York newspapers consistently garbled his surname and spelled it wrong, while it has been assumed that he became nicknamed Lucky in an ironic sense after he luckily survived a gang war attack in October 1929, during which he was beaten so badly he could barely see out of his eyes, and had his throat slashed before being left unconscious in a forest on Staten Island. Others applied the name Lucky to him thereafter, though in person he nearly always went by Charles or Charlie. Luciano had a droopy eye from the attack for the rest of his life. Many of the details of Lucky Luciano's incredible life story are debated today. There are significant reasons for this. Firstly, he was a crime boss, one who necessarily attempted to keep his actions and the details of his life secret for much of his own lifetime in order to avoid police prosecution. But the waters were muddied further by the publication in the mid-1970s, over a decade after Luciano died, of The Last Testament of Lucky Luciano, a memoir of his life which he allegedly dictated to the film producer Martin Gosch in the months prior to his death, in anticipation of making a film version of his story. It was subsequently edited and published after Gosch died in 1973 as a book by Richard Hammer, a freelance writer who Gosch had employed before his death to write up what Luciano had allegedly told him. However, there was immediately a debate even before it was published as to whether the details provided in the book were genuinely related to Gosch by Luciano, or to what extent the memoirs were a work of invention, with the New York Times at the point of publication noting that The Last Testament reproduced errors found in other books which had been written up to that point on the Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian Mafia, a seeming indication that Gosch or Hammer had simply taken much of their information from other secondary literature, rather than The Last Testament being the genuine reflections of Luciano on his life, looking back from the vantage point of the early 1960s. Nevertheless, while it can be difficult to separate fact from fiction when it comes to such a legendary character, the general facts of his life have been well established nearly a century after many of the most important details of it occurred. In just over half a century following the completion of the unification of Italy in the early 1860s, some 15 or so million people left Italy in search of a better life in the Americas, with the overwhelming majority settling in either Argentina or the United States, with Buenos Aires and New York City being the key entry points. The Lucanias were just one such family, setting sail from Sicily bound for the New World in the spring of 1907. This was around the absolute peak of the Italian migration, and there was also a massive influx of Irish, Jews and other groups at this time. 20,000 migrants arrived in just one day to the Lower East Side of New York City, breaking all previous records set up to that point. This was the chaotic environment which greeted the Lucanias as they themselves arrived to the Lower East Side. People heaved everywhere. Poverty was rife. Jobs were available, paid little, garbage lined the streets, the smell was foul. The disease outbreaks were common, compounded around the time the Lucanias arrived to New York by a strike by city street cleaners, a huge number of which were Italians. People lived with 4 families on each floor in the sprawling tenements, with one toilet for all 4 apartments, and with constant noise from the street, plus sweltering heat in the summers, which led some to sleep in the fire escapes at night. This was how America was built. It was not a good environment, and many Italians, Irish, Jews, and others turned to crime in a very short period of time after arriving to better themselves. Luciano was amongst those who were enticed into New York's less legal activities before long. In the late 1900s, there were numerous gangs of children and teenagers operating around the Lower East Side and Manhattan more broadly, picking the pockets of their victims, robbing street vendors, and even getting into low-level gambling operations, often venturing further afield to relieve the wealthier denizens of the great metropolis of their money and belongings while riding the ferries from Manhattan to Staten Island and Queens. Luciano was soon amongst these child hoodlums and before long had formed his own gang, running an operation whereby they extorted protection money from other children in return for keeping them safe on their way to and from school. One day, Luciano and his band of teenage extortionists approached a Jewish kid, and Charles explained that he would have to pay them 5 cents a week for protection. The boy told him in not a very polite fashion that he wouldn't be paying him the money. It was the beginning of a lifelong friendship between Luciano and Maya Lansky, who was over 4 years younger than Luciano and his associates, and whose gumption in standing up to his would-be harassers impressed Lucky. Luciano's father was a traditional Italian working man who continued the humble existence he had lived back in Sicily in New York. He tried to discipline and control Lucky for his criminal activity and his constant non-attendance at school, eventually being sent to a secure school in Brooklyn, where he was forced to attend classes for a few months in 1911. Thereafter, he left entirely at 14 years of age and got a citizen's job working as a clerk at the Goodman Hat Company on Green Street, running north from Lower Manhattan towards the Bowery and Greenwich Village. He would stay working there for 4 years and must have been good at it, as his pay rose steadily. At the same time, though, he was working his way up in the criminal world, running a gang of young criminals on the east side of Manhattan. Clearly, this group was not engaged in minor activities. In June 1916, when he was still just 18 years old, he was arrested in a bar, and Luciano ended up serving his first jail sentence for a term of 8 months at New Hampton Farms Reformatory. When he got out, he briefly returned to his job at Goodman's, but it didn't stick. Luciano's philosophy by then being, quote, "If I have to be a crumb, I'd rather be dead." A crumb to Luciano being the average working man. Thereafter, he became ever more embedded in the New York crime world. He got to know many of the 20th century's most famous criminals during these years. Figures like Al Capone, who were also rising up in the New York underworld at this time, though Capone soon absconded to Chicago after a violent bar fight in Manhattan in 1919 landed him in trouble with the police. Luciano's closest associates after a time were his old friend Maya Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, the latter being another Jewish teenage hoodlum who got his name for being crazy as a bug and his overt willingness to use a gun when needed. On the Italian front, Luciano befriended 2 other important figures at this time: Francesco Castiglia, better known to history as Frank Costello, an Italian from Calabria, the boot of Italy near Sicily on the Italian mainland, and Vito Genovese, another Italian originally from near the city of Naples. Luciano, Lansky, and the others worked together on and off through the late 1910s and early 1920s, but they were small-time criminals at this juncture for the most part. What would change things was their growing association with some of the foremost Italian gangsters in New York, men like Joe the Boss Masseria, who Luciano was close enough to by the late summer of 1922 that when Masseria was targeted by a hitman by the name of Umberto Valenti during a turf war in a failed murder attempt, Luciano was amongst those who later went after Valenti. It was apparently Lucky who remained calm during the engagement and killed him. What allowed Luciano and others like Genovese, Costello and Lansky to go from peripheral figures in New York's underworld to become some of the most dominant criminals on the East Coast of the United States was the prohibition on the sale and supply of alcohol, which was introduced across America through the 18th Amendment in 1920. Prohibition was introduced in many ways as a way for the political establishment in America, which were people of generally British heritage and Protestants, to attack Roman Catholics arriving from Ireland, Italy, and other parts of Europe, and setting up restaurants and bars across the 1900s and 1910s. It had the opposite effect. Firstly, it did not work, and secondly, it became a catalyst for the expansion and professionalization of the Italian, Irish, and Jewish mafias, in particular in cities like New York, Chicago, Boston, and many others. Luciano was one of the great beneficiaries, as he, Lansky, and others began producing, moving, and selling ever greater quantities of bootleg alcohol around the tri-state area during the 1920s. They grew to become some of the foremost figures in Masseria's criminal organization. Without prohibition, it is possible that very few people would know a century later who Salvatore Lucania even was. Luciano and Lansky did not rise entirely owing to their links with Joe Masseria. They had another connection. Arnold Rothstein, often nicknamed the Brain, was a somewhat different kind of early 20th century New York criminal. He was born into an affluent Jewish-American family in Manhattan back in 1882. In the course of the 1910s, he rose on the back of his application of mathematical principles to illegal gambling and a keen business sense, running casinos and horse racing tracks up and down much of the East Coast. He was infamously alleged to have fixed the 1919 World Series of Baseball in order to make $350,000, yet this has never been fully proven. By the mid-1920s, Luciano and Lansky were being mentored by Rothstein, who lent a more businessman-like approach to their burgeoning operations. He also cultivated the idea in them that appearances were important. Did Luciano want to be viewed as a small-time gun for hire or a leading crime boss? Rothstein asked him. Luciano and Lansky both decided on the latter, and as the years went by, they evolved from criminals on the make on the Lower East Side to well-dressed operators living in the suburbs of New York or discreetly in Manhattan hotels under aliases and directing affairs rather than getting their hands dirty moving bootleg alcohol themselves. It was an ethos which would be adopted throughout much of the Italian-American mafia in years to come. It was not all risk-free, far from it. Before they came fully under Rothstein's wing, Luciano was still selling and handling narcotics, even as alcohol was becoming the bread and butter of people like him in the 1920s. In the summer of 1923, he is recorded as regularly meeting a distributor by the name of John Lyons in a pool room on East 14th Street in Manhattan. That is until the day that he realized that Lyons was an undercover cop. After being taken to a police station, they informed him about what he already knew. With his previous conviction from back in 1916, he was looking at a 10-year sentence. To save himself, Luciano gave them some information about a storehouse where they could find a huge quantity of drugs. They checked out the address and confirmed that the information he had given them was accurate. Luciano walked, and he did so without informing on anybody. The storehouse was where he was stashing his own drugs. It was a narrow escape, though one which also gives an insight into how much money he was already making by then. The stash had an estimated street value of $150,000. By then, he was able to survive a loss like that, and within a year, he and Lansky were renting out a suite in the upmarket Claridge Hotel, from where they were directing a brigade of bootleggers who were operating up and down the East Coast, often bringing in narcotics from Canada as well, where the port of Montreal was a major entry point for the North American market in the interwar period. while in due time, Luciano also benefited from Rothstein's connections to people who were importing opium along the main route available for importation in the 1920s from China and the port of Hong Kong. In 1928, Luciano and Lansky had become major players in New York's crime world, operating their own business along with being senior associates of Rothstein and Joe Masseria. A reorientation occurred later that year. In September, Rothstein, who was a notorious gambler, took part in a gambling session in New York, which involved dice, stud poker, and even high card draw. By the time it ended, he had lost $340,000, a sum equivalent to about $6 million today. This was a sum of money Rothstein could have quite easily paid off. Nevertheless, he refused to do so afterwards, claiming that the poker game had been fixed to con him out of a large sum. His refusal to pay up proved very costly indeed, and on the 4th of November, he was shot in the groin near Park Central Hotel. He died in hospital 2 days later, having refused to reveal to police who had shot him. With his death, his empire was divided up between a number of gangsters. Luciano decided to move closer to Joe Masseria in the aftermath of the collapse of Rothstein's empire. It was the beginning of a brief yet significant alliance between them. More broadly, Rothstein's death would have a bearing on events throughout the 1930s. When he died, many of his records were leaked, a great percentage of which included details of bribes he had paid to police and state prosecutors in New York over a period of nearly 20 years. In response, in 1929 and into the early 1930s, a generation of corrupt state officials were ousted across New York and replaced by more zealous newcomers. Chief amongst them was a special state prosecutor by the name of Thomas E. Dewey, who would play a major role in Luciano's life in years to come. Dewey's involvement in Luciano's story lay a few years ahead. What was of more immediate consequence in the aftermath of Rothstein's death was the rivalry which was developing between Masseria and a rival boss by the name of Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano was a Sicilian who had arrived to New York in 1925. Well-dressed, educated, ruthless, and a strangely paradoxical figure. One who was a crime boss yet also spoke Latin and had once considered entering the priesthood. By the late 1920s, he was a growing problem for Masseria, and the attack on Luciano, which left him scarred and nearly dead in 1929, was possibly carried out by some of Maranzano's allies. Masseria responded to his rival's growing power by ordering Luciano, Genovese, and others to murder Gaetano Reina, a former member of the Masseria gang, after he joined Maranzano's crew. With Reina's murder in February 1930, the Castellamarese War broke out between Masseria's crime family and that of Maranzano. The conflict was named for the port town in Sicily where Maranzano and many of his crew members came from. It raged for over a year. Eventually, seeing that Maranzano had gotten the upper hand, Luciano, along with Costello and Genovese, decided to switch sides and agreed to kill their boss. On the 15th of April 1931, in an episode which inspired the famous murder scene from the first Godfather book and film, Luciano met Masseria at the Nuova Villa Tamaro restaurant on Coney Island, where he, Masseria, and others had some food and then played cards. At a certain time, Luciano went to the bathroom, the signal for Genovese and others to enter the premises and gun down Masseria. With the Castellamarese War at an end, Luciano and the others went to work for Maranzano. In the weeks that followed, Maranzano decided to come up with a new dispensation, whereby the different outfits and crews of Italian Americans operating in New York and the wider tri-state area would function, resurrecting an idea which had been proposed by Johnny Torrio, a Chicago boss who had been dominant there in the early 1920s before the rise of Al Capone. He decided that the 5 most prominent outfits would divide power between them, each of them having their own parts of the city, state, and New Jersey, in which they would be in charge of bootlegging, prostitution, gambling, and other criminal activity. They would be called the Five Families and were headed by five of the most powerful bosses of the time: Maranzano himself, Luciano, Giuseppe Profaci, Thomas Galliano, and Vincent Mangano. Each would have the ability to operate independently of each other in their respective zones of influence. But Maranzano decided at the same time to proclaim himself as the capo di tutti capi, the boss of bosses. Through this, each of the other families would pay tribute to him. This concept of a boss of bosses would play a central role in Luciano's story over the next several years, and would be resurrected at various times over the decades that followed. The arrangement did not last long. Within a few months, there was evident tension between Maranzano and Luciano, much of it based on Maranzano's heavy-handedness and also his clear prejudice against their Jewish colleagues like Lansky and Siegel. By the autumn of 1931, Maranzano was already discussing the idea of removing Luciano and others close to him who had been working with Masseria in the 1920s, including Genovese and Costello. Luciano's suspicions about Maranzano's intentions were aroused when the boss of bosses asked him on several occasions what his home address was, to which Luciano dismissively replied that he didn't have a fixed home. Lucky also began planning to murder Maranzano, a plan he accelerated when he got a call in September 1931 asking for him and Genovese to meet him at his new office suite near Grand Central Station on Park Avenue. Instead, Luciano contacted Lansky, who had arranged for 4 hitmen who Maranzano would not recognize to go to his office disguised as Internal Revenue Service officers. It was known that Maranzano was having tax difficulties and was expecting IRS officials to call to his office, so the bodyguards were let in. There, Maranzano was stabbed 6 times. As he fought back, the assassins, who had tried to do things quietly, pulled out their weapons and shot him 4 times. To make sure he was dead, they then slit his throat. Luciano was now in a position of unprecedented power following the rapid disappearance from New York's criminal underworld of Rothstein, Masseria, and Maranzano. He could at this juncture have made a claim to be the boss of bosses, much like Maranzano had tried to set himself up as, particularly so as another major figure, Al Capone, was also about to be removed from the scene out in Chicago, as the authorities there were coming to the end of a case which would see him sentenced to over a decade in prison on charges of tax evasion. Nevertheless, Luciano chose not to claim a position of preponderance. After years of bloodshed, he contended that collegiality and a fair division of territory in which everyone would benefit was the best way of proceeding. Accordingly, within weeks of Maranzano's death, the commission was established, whereby 7 individuals, the heads of the 5 families in New York, plus the head of the Chicago outfit, and a 7th figure from the region in between Cleveland, Ohio, and Buffalo, New York, which in 1931 was Frank or Ciccio Milano, would each meet occasionally to direct the affairs of the Italian-American mafia, which would be run as a decentralized syndicate, with each family administering its own territory and staying out of the affairs of others, except where their interests overlapped. It was the beginning of the mafia as a national crime organization, and Luciano, more than any other individual, brought it about. The next several years were ones of flux for Luciano and his crime family. Genovese became his second-in-command, with Costello as his consigliere. They continued to work closely with Lansky and Siegel and the wider Jewish mob, as well as the other 4 New York families. A transition was undertaken in 1933 when Prohibition came to an end, and the massive loss of revenue was compensated for by an expansion of their activities into many other fields, notably gambling, with Siegel heading out west to try to establish a gambling haven in Galveston, Texas, later relocating to Las Vegas, Nevada. Other initiatives included a growing role in the unions and labor movement, as well as the expansion of the narcotics trade. Luciano became a very wealthy man in the process. He was difficult to pin down, residing at various luxury hotels around Manhattan, notably the Waldorf Astoria, arguably the most esteemed hotel in the whole world at the time, later relocating to the Barbizon Plaza. Despite the plush surroundings, he maintained some of his old habits. One evening at the Barbizon, he ordered silverware and dishes up to his room without any food. An associate of Luciano's had brought him over some spaghetti cooked by his mother. He didn't marry, and at least in the 1920s and 1930s, rarely had any committed relationships other than that with his sometime girlfriend, Gay Orlova, instead dating a string of women for short periods of time, a habit which apparently resulted in a venereal disease, which troubled him periodically throughout his life. The mid-1930s were a period of instability for reasons beyond the end of Prohibition. It was during this period that Thomas Dewey, the New York special investigator who in years to come would become the Republican candidate in both the 1944 and 1948 presidential elections, intensified his efforts to crack down on organized crime in New York. Having acquired a strong supporter when Fiorello LaGuardia, himself the son of Italian immigrants, was elected as mayor of New York in 1934, Dewey set his sights first on Dutch Schultz, a German Jewish mobster who was an associate of Luciano and Lansky. He had diversified out of bootlegging in the early 1930s by becoming a major player in the numbers game or lottery in Harlem. Dewey followed the money and was soon tightening the noose on Schultz, with tax evasion charges. As he did so, Schultz made it known that he was considering trying to kill Dewey. When it became clear what he intended, Luciano and others had no option except to act. Luciano made it clear that murdering a special prosecutor who was close to the mayor and an emerging Republican Party politician would bring unprecedented attention to bear on the mafia's activities and would lead to a major investigation. Consequently, on the 24th of October 1935, Dutch Schultz was murdered in Newark, New Jersey. The problem presented by Dewey did not go away once Schultz was removed from the scene. Instead, it only got worse for Lucky. On the 1st of February 1936, just over 3 months after Schultz's murder, Dewey oversaw the simultaneous launching of police raids on a huge number of brothels all over Manhattan and Brooklyn. Over 100 prostitutes were arrested, along with madams and brothel managers. Questioning followed. Many didn't have much information to provide other than what was readily apparent to anyone who had raided the establishments. But Dewey and his colleagues managed to pull together enough information to just about come up with a case to charge Luciano with pandering, a crime which involves profiting from the vices or weaknesses of others, one which was usually used against pimps and brothel runners. As the investigation team did its work, operating out of the Woolworth building in Tribeca, which until 1930 had held the crown of the world's tallest building, Luciano was down in Miami, Florida, where he often spent the colder winter months overseeing the mob's growing business in Florida and offshore in Havana, Cuba. He received word there from Lansky about the brothel raids and decided to make himself scarce, heading out to Hot Springs in Arkansas, where the mob had several casinos and numerous biddable politicians on the payroll. He waited there to see how events in New York would unfold. In the weeks that followed, Luciano's whereabouts in Arkansas were discovered, and he was eventually picked up and put on a train under armed escort in mid-April 1936. Returned to New York, he was greeted by a crowd of journalists at Penn Station and was put in front of a judge a few hours later. There, Dewey began his attack, stating that Luciano was the head of a wide-ranging, yet still improperly understood criminal enterprise with nationwide concerns. He believed Luciano was a very wealthy man and requested a bail of $350,000. The judge agreed. The arraignment had set a precedent, whereby Dewey would attempt to turn what was a fairly flimsy vice and pandering charge into a much wider case concerning Luciano's criminal affairs in general, despite a resounding lack of evidence on matters pertaining to the narcotics trade, gambling, and other areas of activity. The trial began just over 3 weeks later and lasted 1 month. Dewey followed his initial pattern at the arraignment of making it about much more than the vice and pandering offences, and instead built up a case concerning Luciano's wider role as a leading New York criminal boss. It culminated in Luciano taking the stand. During cross-examination, Dewey got the better of him, with Lucky slipping at one juncture during a lengthy session in which he lied about virtually everything else, but admitted to being a minor bootlegger for a time in the 1920s, as Dewey questioned how he had become so wealthy without having a legitimate job throughout the Prohibition era. This and other revelations led the jury to determine that Luciano's testimony could not be trusted. His lawyer had already told him before the verdict came down that he would be found guilty. 11 days later, the judge sentenced him to 30 to 50 years in prison. The sentence, when it came, was a major blow to Luciano. Although he had expected to be found guilty on some offences, it had never seemed feasible that he would be given what in reality amounted to nearly a life sentence. There were serious questions asked at the time about how the case was prosecuted and the nature of the evidence, with Meyer Lansky proclaiming that his buddy Charlie had been set up. He was perhaps not entirely incorrect. While there is little doubt that the mafia was involved in prostitution in New York, the level of that involvement was debatable. During the 1920s and early 1930s, it was negligible, and Luciano appears to have had almost zero involvement, as figures like him viewed it as hardly worth the effort when money could be made much more easily from bootlegging. In the mid-1930s, with Prohibition ending and the Great Depression continuing to impact on businesses countrywide, the illegal variety included, Luciano and his many associates did become involved in prostitution in New York. But even then, he viewed it as a small sideline which didn't generate a lot of money. His role was certainly peripheral enough that at least some of the evidence presented against him in court was exaggerated. More broadly, Dewey had made the court case a prosecution of Luciano's wider life and career, for much of which he had only speculation and hearsay to go on. The judge had been happy to proceed on this basis, however, and in the end, Luciano was convicted in a manner which was excessive based on the available evidence. Luciano appealed his conviction, but to no avail. He was going to prison. There he would try to maintain some role in the running of New York's underworld. However, for the most part, Vito Genovese took over as acting head of the Luciano crime family, with Frank Costello succeeding him within a year as Genovese fled to Italy after Dewey began focusing on his activities, notably the murder of Ferdinand Boccia in 1934. Luciano was originally sent to Sing Sing prison, a place where when it was first built, the cells measured 7 foot by 3.5 foot and were just 6.5 foot from floor to ceiling. New, saner cells were built in the 1920s and 1930s, but Sing Sing deserved its fearsome reputation. Luckily for Lucky Luciano, he was quickly moved from there to Dannemora prison, though things were far from pleasant here either. Dannemora was notoriously cold and was dubbed Siberia by the inmates. Luciano quickly established himself as the most important prisoner, brokering a peace between rival gangs and evidently bribing a significant enough portion of the guards that the conditions of his detention became relatively pleasant. That said, Dannemora lay further upstate in New York, and he found it nigh on impossible to continue to play a role in managing affairs in New York in the late 1930s. By the time Lucky's minimum sentence of 30 years in prison would have been served, it would have been 1966. He would have been nearing his 70th year, and there is no guarantee he would have been released at that juncture. As such, Luciano would almost certainly have spent most of the rest of his life in an American prison, serving out the pandering conviction had it not been for events far away in Europe. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, leading Britain and France to declare war on it 2 days later, in the inception of the Second World War. In the second half of 1940, after Italy entered the war, North Africa became a major theatre of the conflict, as the Italians and Germans tried to secure the Suez Canal in Egypt. When the US entered the conflict in December 1941, after Germany's ally, the Empire of Japan, attacked the Pacific Fleet at anchor in Pearl Harbor, the US and Britain decided to prioritize the North Africa campaign, with a view to securing the Maghreb and then opening a southern front in Europe by launching an invasion of Sicily and southern Italy. As these plans were developed, the administration of President Roosevelt in Washington began to consider forming an alliance with the Italian mafia to aid them with their contacts in Italy. It would be Luciano's salvation. On the 9th of February 1942, almost exactly 2 months after the US entered the war, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the SS Normandy, a French ship which had been captured by the US and was rechristened as the Lafayette, with ambitions to repurpose it as a troop carrier for the war effort, caught fire while undergoing repair work in New York Harbor. It sank the following day. In the days that followed, suspicions arose that the fire had been intentionally started by a German agent of some kind. This was one of the key reasons why the US government approached a number of figures within the Italian and Jewish crime syndicates of New York, including Luciano's close friend and ally, Meyer Lansky, in the spring of 1942. They hoped to use the mob's massive influence over New York's docklands and workers to prevent further arson attacks and to block foreign agents from coming in through the port. Early on in these talks, Luciano's imprisonment became a point of discussion. He was moved to Great Meadow Correctional Facility closer to New York, a much more comfortable situation for him, and promises were made that in return for his aid, his sentence would be commuted once the war ended. In return, the US government would have the cooperation of the Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian mafia, in managing the port of New York and the labor unions for the duration of the war. Luciano also promised to use his contacts in Sicily and southern Italy to facilitate the Allied invasion of the peninsula as much as possible. This entire arrangement is typically known as Operation Underworld, though it is a major point of debate as to whether the government viewed it as a formal arrangement or operation. The extent to which Luciano managed to aid the government is somewhat conjectural. It is, for instance, believed that he put the US government in contact with Calogero Vizzini, the most powerful figure within Cosa Nostra back in Sicily itself. Legend has it that during the Allied invasion of the island in the summer of 1943, Vizzini spent a week riding around between the towns and villages of Sicily in an American tank, convincing people to lay down their arms and welcome the Americans. Meanwhile, in New York, Costello, Lansky, and others facilitated a wide range of other measures which the government required. While many historians have cast doubt on the significance of Luciano's aid to the government during the Second World War, there is no doubt that in January 1946, once the conflict was over, his sentence was commuted and he was released from prison, after serving just 9.5 years of a 30 to 50-year prison sentence. That said, nobody in Washington was anxious to have him hanging around in New York. The terms of his release were that he was to be deported back to Italy immediately. As such, after one last meal with some of his associates since the 1920s, on board the ship that would convey him back to the homeland, Luciano was deported from America on the 10th of February 1946. Lucky arrived in Naples 2.5 weeks later. He seems to have had little intention of staying there. Instead, he intended to relocate to Cuba. The Caribbean island had been a quasi-American colony for over 4 decades, ever since the Spanish-American War of 1898 had ousted the Spanish from the island and allowed the US to set up a system of oversight, which allowed it to largely decide who was in charge of the country. Usually the individuals so chosen were wildly corrupt, and as well as being closely aligned with Washington, the island had also become an offshore playground for the mafia. One where gambling was legal and a few dollars could lead to blind eyes being turned quite easily. It was also close enough to the US that Luciano could keep a hand in running affairs in New York without the fear of extradition. And so in the autumn of 1946, he set off for Cuba, taking a circuitous route through several South and Central American countries, to ensure that he shrugged off any American or Italian police who were monitoring his movements. He arrived in the capital Havana in October 1946. Within days of arriving in Cuba, Luciano was organizing a major meeting of the heads of the Italian and Jewish mafias from New York and further afield. The Havana Conference took place at the Hotel Nacional from the 22nd of December 1946 onwards, continuing through Christmas. There were a wide range of things to be discussed. A notable topic was the mob's growing involvement in the development of Las Vegas. Bugsy Siegel, a Jewish-American mobster who had been involved with Luciano and many others since the 1920s, had been the visionary behind the mafia's quest to establish a gambling oasis out west. But his management of the construction and opening of the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas had been disastrous, and Siegel had clearly lined his own pockets with the mob's investments while working on it. Lansky, who had known Bugsy since they were teenagers in New York, but when the Flamingo's opening night was a shambles, a decision was taken to murder Siegel, and he was killed in Los Angeles in the summer of 1947. Other issues discussed included narcotics, the unions, gambling, the Italian lottery in New York, and the respective positions of Genovese and Costello in New York, Genovese having returned from Italy after the war ended. Eventually, Luciano met with Genovese alone, and after a discussion in which Vito urged him to claim the title of boss of bosses and then let him exercise the position on the ground in America, Luciano angrily told him he didn't want to ever hear the idea mentioned again. With the end of the Havana meeting, most of the attendees headed back to the US and resumed their operations. Luciano, of course, could not. He remained on in Havana, enjoying the fact that for once he was not being observed by either the US or Italian police. Quite the contrary, in fact. Instead, he was something of a local celebrity, one who met regularly with the Cuban president, Ramon Grau, and was invited to social occasions by prominent American businessmen with interests in Havana. Those who knew him at the time stated later that this was a period in which he was quite happy with his circumstances. Inevitably, it didn't last. By the spring of 1947, journalists in Cuba had begun to receive reports that the Mafia Don was living in Havana, and as photos of him appeared in a growing number of newspapers, American political agents in Cuba had to act. Pressure was applied on Grau's administration by restricting the import of various medicines to Cuba from America, and with this the government in Havana politely detained Luciano in March 1947 and informed him that he was to be deported back to Italy. Thus, in mid-March, he boarded the Bakir ship bound for Europe. Although he paid $300 for a first-class cabin, he was reported to have spent much of his time playing cards with tourists in economy as he headed east back to his homeland. It has been speculated that the details of his presence in Cuba were leaked by some of his associates after the conference, fearing that Luciano intended to try to continue running affairs in New York from Havana. While the post-war period saw Luciano being prevented from playing a leading role in the Italian-American mafia, following his release from prison, his personal life did shift after his return to Italy from Cuba. He had never married or had children and seemed to have no interest in doing so. Yet in early 1948, he did begin a relationship with a woman whom he would term the love of his life. Igea Lissoni was a 26-year-old woman whom Luciano first met in Milan. She was a dancer who had performed at the La Scala Opera House in her youth. Luciano was apparently too shy to ask her out when they first met, but later he attended a nightclub in Rome where she was performing, and before long they were seeing one another. She moved into his Rome apartment just a few weeks later. "She's the only girl I ever loved," Luciano later related. Due to the police continuously harassing Lucky in Rome, they eventually had to move to Naples, where they lived in a penthouse apartment on the Via Tasso with a panoramic view of Mount Vesuvius and the Bay of Naples. They would never have children though, with Luciano claiming he didn't want any child to grow up tarred with being Lucky Luciano's child. Luciano and Lissoni lived a somewhat quiet life in Naples, despite the efforts of the Italian police to continue digging up information on his alleged criminal activity. There was no doubt that there was some illegal activity. One of Luciano's pastimes was visiting the horse tracks in Naples, where he invariably won. The races were undoubtedly fixed at least some of the time. Other than this, he continued to have contacts with the Italian mafia, although less so with people back in America, meeting people who visited Italy from New York, but little more than that. Police reports from the 1950s noted that he continued to spend considerably more money than he was earning through any legal channels, yet they could never make anything stick to him. This quiet and relatively happy period of his life came to an end in October 1958, when Lissoni died of breast cancer at just 36 years of age. Friends noted he cried at her funeral, something they had never seen before. A magazine article for which he had been interviewed and which appeared not long after Lissoni's death described him as a tight-lipped individual who met many questions with silence. The same interviewer concluded that, quote, "His life is a quiet one, and his greatest desire is to forget and be forgotten." At the same time that Luciano was living his relatively quiet life in Italy, one which surely felt like an exile, yet was actually a return to his homeland, a rivalry was brewing in New York between two of his oldest allies. Genovese never accepted the fact that Costello had succeeded him as the head of the Luciano crime family in New York after he fled to Italy in the late 1930s. Costello's unwillingness to relinquish the position after the war when Genovese returned to America was a source of growing tension between the two figures. Costello's position was weakened in the early 1950s by the Kefauver hearings, where the US Senate forced him and many other figures to testify about the existence of an organized crime syndicate amongst Italian Americans. Finally, in 1957, Genovese tried to have Costello murdered. He survived the attempted hit carried out by Vincent the Chin Gigante. However, Costello decided to retire and allow Genovese to take over at this juncture, rather than engaging in a bloody and possibly protracted power struggle. With this, Genovese became the head of the Luciano crime family, but ironically, the man after whom the outfit was named was never happy with this decision far away in Italy. It has been suggested on more than one occasion that Luciano was in some way involved when charges were pressed against Genovese in New York not long after he took over affairs there. Genovese was implicated in a large sale of narcotics and would eventually be sentenced to 15 years in prison in 1959. He surrendered himself and began his sentence in 1960, and would die in prison in 1969. There is certainly a case to be made that the incident which brought Genovese down, an alleged deal with a low-level Puerto Rican drug dealer, seems curious. Why would Genovese have been directly involved in such a deal, instead of letting a minion handle it? Whether Luciano, who had been visited on a few occasions in Naples by agents of the US Federal Bureau of Narcotics in the late 1950s, was involved remains speculative, though friends who knew him in Italy in his later years did recount that news of Genovese's conviction and imprisonment was one of the few things that cheered Luciano up in the months following Lissoni's death. Luciano's final years were spent living in Naples. Somewhat surprisingly, he was not especially well off during these years, in part because much of his revenue was coming in from Havana, and after the success of the Cuban Revolution, the mafia's activities there came to an end in 1959. While the changing of the guard in New York saw much of the residual payments he received from there over the years dry up. He resented this, and it rubbed salt in the wound when Joey Adonis, one of Luciano's gunmen back in the 1920s and a much more junior figure in the mob in general, arrived in Italy in 1956 after agreeing to be deported from America after a perjury charge, setting himself up in Milan in a grand mansion where he held court in a manner which Luciano was financially incapable of. It was in an effort to turn his ailing financial situation around that he agreed to discuss a movie project based on his life with Martin Gosch in the early 1960s. The timing seemed propitious, as a feature film starring Rod Steiger on the life of Al Capone had appeared in 1959, and Murder, Inc., another gangster film, was released a year later. In the last months of his life, Luciano had been in contact with Gosch and was laying the groundwork for such a film, though how this project would have been received by those who were still active in the mafia is very debatable. As it turned out, the film would never come to fruition. On the evening of the 26th of January 1962, Luciano headed to Capodichino Airport in Naples to meet Gosch as he got off a plane flying in from Rome. They were planning to complete the work on the movie script over the next several days. Instead, Luciano collapsed as they walked from the terminal. When a doctor attended shortly afterwards, he pronounced him dead. He had passed of a heart attack at 64 years of age. Word quickly spread out internationally, with news of his death featuring the following day on the front page of the New York Times. There were other revelations in the days that followed about how Lucky was under investigation at the time of his death for his role in a $150 million narcotics ring between Europe and the US, which had been operating for decades. Luciano's funeral was held 3 days later in Naples. Approximately 300 guests attended, doubtlessly a smaller number than would have been the case had he died in New York. The ceremony was disturbed by scuffles which broke out when over-enthusiastic photojournalists got too close to the mourners. His body was originally taken by a horse-drawn hearse to Poggio Reale Cemetery on the outskirts of Naples, but an arrangement was subsequently reached whereby his body was repatriated to America. 2,000 mourners attended his burial in Queens. By the time Luciano died, investigations into the extent of the mafia's activities were escalating in America. Genovese was already in prison. In 1963, Joseph Valacchi gave testimony to U.S. Senate hearings in which he revealed how the organized mafia in America had come into being, including the central role Luciano had played in the creation of the commission back in 1931. Although it took 20 years for the tide to turn, by the 1980s all of these revelations and attacks on the mafia's extensive involvement in the narcotics trade, gambling and control of labor and the unions began to pay off. That decade saw their influence in Las Vegas vanquished and widespread arrests and successful prosecutions. A half a century after he built it up in the early 1930s, Luciano's mafia was beginning to decline. In 1998, when it published its list of the 100 most important persons of the 20th century, Time magazine included Charles Lucky Luciano in its list of builders and titans on account of his role in the emergence of the Italian-American mafia as the foremost criminal enterprise in the United States during the 20th century. He featured in this particular section of the list alongside Walt Disney, Henry Ford, Bill Gates, and Ray Kroc, respectively the pioneers behind Disney, Ford Automobiles, Microsoft, and McDonald's. It was a left-of-center choice by Time and entirely fitting at the same time. Luciano was the most significant figure in the history of the Italian-American mafia, emerging out of the East Side in the late 1910s and forged through Prohibition. He came out of the pivotal Castellamarese War of the early 1930s as the most powerful mafia figure in New York, and countrywide by extension. At that juncture, he could have continued the divisive attempts to claim absolute power, which had led to conflict for many years. But instead, he elected to rule as the first of equals, and in the process allowed the mafia to begin strengthening its network on a national level, and expanding into new cities and to develop operations as far afield as Las Vegas, Nevada, and Havana, Cuba. Although owing to his arrest and incarceration in 1936, he was eclipsed during much of his later life by figures like Genovese and Costello, there is no doubting that for better or for worse, Lucky Luciano was the single most important figure in the history of the Italian-American mafia. What do you think of Lucky Luciano? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, Thank you very much for watching.